Kia ora. I have to wait for the green light, do I? Oh, kia ora. Kia ora. E karakia, a te kaunihira. Ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana i ngā take kei mua o mātou aroaro. E pono ana mātou ka kaha tonu ki te wai, ki te whakapau, mahara, hua pai mō ngā hāpori e mahi nei mātou. Me kaha hoki, mātou katoa kia whaihua, kia tōtika tā mātou mahi, mā te maia, te tiro mā whakamaua, me te hirihiri, ka taia te arahia o roto i te kotahitanga me te aroha. Kia ora mai rā.
Thank you very much, Chris. So the next item on the agenda is apologies. I've had none notified to me. Are there any other apologies from other members? Oh, yes. Thank you.
And I'll just also have to pop out briefly at 10 o'clock for about 15 minutes or so.
Thank you, Councillor Hanford. So I will move those apologies. Who will second it? Thank you, Mr. Black. All those in favour, say aye. Those against? Motion is passed. So now we will move on to item 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. Are there any items, are there any declarations of any interest? Thank you. So now we will move on to public speaking time for items that relate to the agenda. So I've been notified of one speaker, Mr. Evans, who will be speaking on stormwater related issues. Thank you, Mr. Evans. If you'd like to come and sit at the table, and if someone will help you pressing the button to be able to speak. Thank you.
Okay, now this has been brought up several times in the past with full councils on stormwater issues, which is a very big issue in the Kāpiti area. One of the biggest things that I see walking down the beach off Manly Street, the northern end and the southern end is creeping back. It's been cut back through waves and the winds and everything. Now, I have implemented, or sort of basically said to council before, that they put groins out there. Now, groins stop the wave link. They create a build-up of sand to stop the erosion. One instance in the past where I used to visit my grandfather, Tom Coltman, the Grand Hotel, is that where he lived, the southern end of, I think it was Matai Road or somewhere down there anyway, basically was, they had so much erosion in the past with the sea eating the embankment down there, that they put groins and a wall. Now, if you go, if any of you were to go down there and see what it's built up, the amount of sand, stop the erosion and everything, we should have something like that, basically just by putting groins there at the northern end, which is cutting back, and the southern end. We've got big problems in the future if we don't do it now. And I can see the residents down there, you know, they put boulders down there. I think that was done privately, and that's sunk. So basically, you know, that's something which is going to cost us a lot of money if you don't do it shortly. Secondly, up Manly Street is the other thing which also relates to stormwater. is the Putakawa trees down there. And I've got photos there which I was going to bring along, but I'll get them to those who are on council. You see the roots of these Putakawa trees going under the footpaths, under the roads. Chorus have said to me many times, when are they going to fix this? Of course, people have tripped over those slabs that have risen on the footpath. It's dangerous. And, you know, that's another one, which basically, if it's not fixed now, it's going to cost us in the long term, a lot of money. When you see pictures of these roots or those Putakawa trees, you'd say, oh, how's it been left so long? And it needs, you know, isn't it better to fix it now than wait where we can't afford to pay for it and get it fixed? It comes and up goes the rates and everything else. I mean, we've got to look at all those issues. The longer we leave it, the more it's going to cost us. And to me, there's two prime examples of that. I look at stormwater issues, which I was in charge when I was on the community board, basically, and I had stormwater action group. And we had about 1,000 members on there. And I sort of basically gave up because no one was listening. Stormwater is one of the biggest issues up here. It's going to be, and if it's not addressed properly, we're going to have big debt.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Do any members of the committee have any questions for Mr. Evans? I have one question. So the Pahutakawa, are they actually on the berm, or where are they in relation to the street?
Sorry, say it again.
The Pahutakawa trees that you mentioned,
They're in Manly Street on the side of the footpath.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And I've mentioned that to many people, residents down there, and they have said to me, look, we need to do something about this, but I'm all for not knocking down trees, because I like trees. My father was like that. We hate, it's an environment thing. But they can be all taken down and planted again. Isn't it better to do it now than leave it where it's going to cost a lot of money to do it, and it's going to affect people working on the road, the roading, the footpath.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming along and raising
That's all right.
these
Well,
matters.
hopefully you're going to listen this time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right here.
Might be interesting to listen to one of the presentations we have today on stormwater. So now we will move on to members' business. I don't believe there's any members' business. Actually, sorry, no, I tell a lie. Item 6. Does any member of the committee have any leave of absence that they would like to apply for? If not through me, they can contact the mayor. Thank you. So now item B, matters of an urgent nature, which has to be advised to the chair prior to the commencement of the meeting. So we have actually two items of an urgent nature that are going to be added to the agenda. One is to do with an update on the Mangoni stream. That will be discussed by staff when they are available, which will be at some point in the meeting. And the other matter is us having a forward planning conversation about what potential topics could go into the agenda items over the next year or so. So we will slot that in due course as well. So now I would like to invite our first person to give their update, and that is from council staff on the stormwater strategy and framework. So I've invite Rita O'Brien to come to the table, please.
Ko Aoraki toku mauna, ko Mawhiranui toku awa, ko Kelt, toku iwi, ko O'Brien, toku hapu, ko Rita aho. I'm one of the stormwater and coastal engineers at Council, and I'm here just to give you a brief update on the stormwater management framework and associated stuff. I keep meaning to learn my title in Te Reo, so one day that will happen, but it's very long and I can never remember it. And I apologise, I've got the name of the committee wrong as well. So there we go. Okay, and I'm very technically coordinated, so we'll see. Oh, yeah, cool. Okay, so the purpose of the briefing, I'm going to give you a brief update on the stormwater management framework. Can't really do that unless we have a little bit of a discussion around Te Mana o Te Wai and the Whaitoa. And through the chair, I'm happy to answer questions as we go or at the end, whichever is more comfortable for you. Okay, so a bit of background. We have a current stormwater management strategy that was adopted in 2008. It needs reviewing, obviously, because I think there was a rolling kind of review that every 10 years we'd have a look at them. And some things have changed since we did that original strategy. We have a regional planning framework that requires all local authorities to develop a stormwater management strategy to support their second generation global discharge consents. We've had a global discharge consent for ages, like we volunteered it, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. The new regional plan required all TAs to have consents, because Wellington Water did, but none of the other TAs did. So we got our first generation and we're in the process, we've just applied for our second generation consent. As part of that, we had to provide a draft stormwater management strategy. That strategy is only really concerned with water quality though, and how the consent will meet the objectives of the regional plan. And we're required, and we wish to partner with iwi through all these processes. Okay, so just to put it into a bit of a context, I've put Te Mana o Te Wai at the top only because it has coloured a lot of stuff. A lot of the Three Waters has a key principle of Te Mana o Te Wai. A lot of the legislation that's being adopted and changed has that slant over it. And I think National have said, although Three Waters might change, there is no they're not going to look at changing Te Mana o Te Wai, so it's kind of here to stay. Under that, we've got the Resource Management Act, which most of you will be familiar with. It's like the planning stuff. Under the Resource Management Act, there's like some national policy statements and some national environmental standards that councils must give effect to, and either us or Greater Wellington or both. So the one that's driving Te Mana o Te Wai is around the national policy statement for freshwater management. We've also got a couple of conflicting ones. So we've got the stormwater policy statement on urban development, so we need to provide for intensification and growth. We also have ones that aren't listed up there, like the forestry. There's a national environmental standard for forestry. And there's a couple of proposed and draft ones. There's one on flood management and there's one on biodiversity, Indigenous biodiversity. We have the Local Government Act, which requires us to provide infrastructure at cost-effective manner, and that sets the framework for the long-term plan, development contributions, service levels agreements, as well as setting out a special consultative process for policy development, strategic developments and bylaws. And we've got a lot of other things that exist in this space as well that kind of sits outside of Te Mana o Te Wai, but they're things that TAs and councils have to be mindful of in terms of our response to resilience, climate change, and just land drainage, stormwater stuff. And then we also have sitting in this space ki uta ki tai, which is basically the mountains to sea, and it's one of the underpinning objectives in the regional plan. And I suppose the Waikanae River Mountains to Sea project is an example of that in action. Okie dokie. So we've developed, or last year it was adopted, the Stormwater Management Framework. I'll go into the details of it in the next couple of slides. Sitting underneath this sort of umbrella framework, there's the Schedule N Stormwater Management Strategy, which is what I've discussed in the previous slide around this is Greater Wellington's requirement for a stormwater management strategy. So in that strategy, we define the catchment and network characteristics, and we prioritise catchments for maintenance and improvement of our discharge from our network. It is a bit tricky because there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation with the Whaitua, which is Greater Wellington's response to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and our discharge consent, because it was envisaged when the plan was put together that all the Whaitua would be finished by the time councils were applying for their second generation discharge permits. But we're in a situation where the Whaitua is just landed and is progressing within the next 12 months or whatever. But we're also being required to apply for our second stage consent. So there are some gaps in what we've put into Greater Wellington as a draft stormwater management strategy, because we don't know. There's some stuff that's going to come out of the Whaitua that will inform that document. That document remains strategic, and then we have our existing stormwater management strategy, 2008, which collates all the things like flood management, hydraulic neutrality, climate change and sea level rise into a strategic document. So the Greater Wellington stuff is all around allocation and the quality of our discharge. The emphasis on our existing stuff was all around the discharge quantity rather than the quality of the discharge. The idea is that we need to relook at our stormwater management strategy in terms of flood risk and management, climate change and hydraulic neutrality. It all needs to be adapted and changed. Things have moved on since 2008, you can appreciate. And the idea is that that single document potentially could transform into different policy and strategic documents. So we won't lose anything, and it's sort of it will be picked up as work streams develop the threads, and obviously it will be coming back to council for discussion and under the Local Government Act, all that sort of stuff is actually open for public consultation, so there'll be a special consultative process. The one, I suppose, because how it gets a wee bit more complicated is that it's like a web. Things don't cascade naturally down a linear process. So although, like the stormwater management strategy under the regional plan structure is around water quality, you can't divorce that from, say, land use, or you can't divorce that from managing a flood risk. And some other stuff in how we deal with climate change on the ground, how we deal with hydraulic neutrality and manage flood risk will actually impact upon, how we maintain and improve water quality in our streams and rivers and provide habitat. So it's a bit of a juggling act. There is no, I suppose, it's hard to prioritise. So we have, there's a deliberate mistake in the side. It was adopted last year in 2022. So we've got a stormwater management framework that gives us vision, values and outcomes. I'll tell you how we got to that point for those that weren't involved a bit later in the slides. We then have the Schedule N water quality stuff, which is a Greater Wellington Council approval process, so it's within a consenting framework. So the stuff that goes into the Greater Wellington consent doesn't necessarily get publicly notified or socialised with the public. But having said that, eventually the whaitua will. So the whaitua, whatever recommendations come out of the whaitua process, will actually be publicly notified through a plan change at some point in the next couple of years. And then we have our own, so I suppose, land management type stuff like hydraulic neutrality and flood risk and management, which will actually be consulted on over the next couple of years as those work streams are progressed. And obviously there's a whole implementation process through the long-term plan, which will also come back through public consultation and council. Okay, so the idea of the stormwater management framework was to try to provide some overarching structure to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, to mitigate, reduce the effects of flooding and climate change, and to provide some provision for growth and urban intensification. And it's all mandated through various statutes that don't always talk to each other. You know, there isn't a natural hierarchy sometimes with these. That's right. Okay, so Te Mana o Te Wai, which no one probably will be able to read on the screen. I borrowed this with permission from Dr. Mahinorangi Baker. So it gives you a bit of just an overview of what Te Mana o Te Wai kind of is, the basic framework. So Te Mana o Te Wai is basically the health or the mana of our waters. And it's just not just a Māori thing. You know, I think everyone in this room and the community would want better quality water to be able to be, you know, like your grandkids swimming in the water, fishing in the water. So to address some of the imbalance, the first priority for water is the environment. So what is necessary to provide for a healthy, functioning habitat and awa. The second priority is water for public supply. The third priority, and probably a distant third, is wastewater and stormwater and other uses for water. Okay, so there is a list of values or principles, they're called in Te Mana o Te Wai, 3 in Te Reo and Māori and 3 in English. And I think that distinction is important, and it's how we've framed the stormwater management framework, because it's really easy to misappropriate Māori words, and you know they have a richer and more fuller meaning to Māori than they would to European. So the European words are a rough translation of the Te Reo words, but kind of doesn't give the full scope of the feeling and meaning that someone, you know, from that culture would have. But it allows, I didn't touch it. Okay. But it allows access for both European and Māori to the concepts.
Before you move on, for those who are watching the live stream, apparently it's cutting in and out, so our IT have just come along to try and sort the problem out. So apologies to those watching online.
That's right, you did. And then I suppose it's the whole two-house model. Like there's an iwi component and there's a Crown component. Okay, so the stormwater management strategy framework. The overarching objective is that Kāpiti has a stormwater system where water is given space to flow from the hills to the sea. That doesn't necessarily mean we get it there as fast as possible. It's about giving it space. Like, it may be appropriate that it needs to move quickly, but it's also maybe appropriate that it needs to feed biodiversity, wetlands en route, constructed wetlands, natural wetlands. So allowing, and when we do new development, it might be that if there's a stream or a drain, a watercourse within that development, that we actually give it enough space to do what it needs to do. Piping is, in effect, not permitted anymore. So, you know, like you want the stream maybe to meander naturally, you wanted a bit of space so that people aren't trying to constrain it within, you know, its, you know, so that they can get as much developable, you know, land right up to the stream. The health of our waterways are enhanced and restored. Communities are thoughtfully planned to be protected from flooding and resilient to anticipated climate change impacts, and council works in partnership with Tanawa Whenua to give expression to Te Mana o Te Wai. We have a series of 6 values, and they're both in Te Reo and English with a bit of a explanation. So they're slightly different from the Te Mana o Te Wai values in the national legislation, but kind of similar. We've added a few about being holistic, thinking holistically, and acting holistically, and about well-beings, communities' well-being, and mana, for want of a better word, is actually associated with how we treat the environment and our waterways. And we have a lot of care groups out there that would feel the same way about the stream that they are friends with. We still want to take an innovative and flexible approach, and we want our communities to be resilient and connected to their waterways. So I'll speed this up because I can talk for hours on this. Outcomes. I can see Sean getting... the outcomes for the stormwater management in Kāpiti. So basically, that Te Mana o Te Wai, including our stormwater network, is cared for and improved for the environment and people. I suppose it's interesting, Kāpiti is different from some of the other TAs in the Wellington region in that we do have a lot of urban waterways. So a lot of our network is piped, then there'll be a bit of open section, then it'll be piped again, then it'll be open section. And most of our streams that all this stuff feeds into are still open waterways. Knowledge about Te Mana o Te Wai and how it is best cared for is increased and shared. Knowledge about, we're just on that one. The framework delivers a clear and usable plan that delivers quality outcomes and ensures integrity with the vision. Iwi and council work as partners to jointly make decisions with the support of the community. When this went out for public engagement, with the support of the community was something that the community wasn't that keen on because they felt that was sidelining them. The original stormwater management strategy has quite a bit around that council will engage with the local community that are affected by the issue. And there's nothing in this that's negating that. You know, that is still council's responsibility and wish to work with affected communities to find a solution that works in their neighbourhood. And some of that detail, and one of the other criticisms was that this was so high level that they didn't quite understand where the detail would come. And that is, look, this is a framework, the detail will come later and be publicly notified and consulted on. And then stormwater management practices and stormwater infrastructure improves neighbourhoods and ecosystems and resilience to anticipated climate change impacts. So that's basically the framework in a nutshell. How we got there, we had nominated iwi representatives plus council, Greater Wellington, and specialist experts. So I had our water quality consultant and our flood, the guys that are rebuilding our flood hazard models in the room as well. We agreed to terms of reference with iwi. We had about 11 meetings over, I don't know, just over, 12 months. We invited other people across council to come to those meetings just to make sure that we were actually aligned with other projects like the growth strategy, climate change, Kāpiti Whaitua. We had guys from the Kāpiti Whaitua team coming to those meetings because there is quite a bit of synergy and we didn't want to do all this. And we were aware actually of the Mountains to Sea project as well and where they'd landed. So we didn't want this to be preempted by something that was going to come over the top of us. So Penny, who's here, and Tim came to some of those meetings as well and participated. And we developed a draft vision, values and outcomes. Okay, so that's it for the stormwater management framework. Yes.
I'd just like to ask at this point, do any members have any questions of Rita? We have an opportunity if you'd like to leave it till then as well.
Sorry,
Yes.
Madam Chair. Rita, just a quick question. You just alluded to the streams and the rivers being left wide open and developments sort of because of, and you suggested there was pressure of developments building as close to them as possible. Could you just clarify that?
I suppose under the current district plan, we have a setback from streams and rivers. So it kind of depends how big the stream is. And quite often, I suppose those rules have been in for quite some time and were probably a hangover from the old district plan. And sometimes it's quite hard to, maintain that, and people put sort of garden sheds and all sorts of stuff on it. But also, the more we learn about how the interaction between the riparian margin, the stream, and others, we should actually probably be leaving a larger buffer to allow the stream to breathe, if you want. Because if you've got, and some of our streams, they'll be retained, or we have issues with erosion. So if you haven't allowed enough space, people get concerned about, the eating in of their land when the stream or the drain, for want of a better word, is doing what it naturally does. It meanders. And if you don't leave it enough room to kind of do that safely, then it can cause issues later. And then there's the whole interface between public and private. Technically, council is concerned with the conveyance of stormwater. We don't necessarily protect private land from that meander, so allowing more space and riparian planting actually could fix some of these other issues. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Kim.
Mine's just a housekeeping question, and happy to take it offline if you think it's more appropriate. But when a lot of the times we have these things and we see who we've engaged to do this work, for me it's really helpful to know how many meetings and who was there, because then it gives me an idea whether it's been a full engagement, whether it's been a one-off, because and I don't expect that kind of detail in the report, but then I can get a sense of actually who's actually inputting into this and who's influencing these decisions. Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Yep, no, I'm happy to discuss that. We spent a lot of time, and although I've said the 12-month time frame, it actually occurred we had meetings prior to that. All three iwi came to all three. Ngāti Toa potentially dropped out. We had a representative initially for most of the meetings, and then she left, and it was quite difficult to get someone else to engage, to come along. But we'd all, I suppose, Te Mana o Te Wai, it's, although there are differences, it's kind of an underpinning thing, the mana of why. So I wasn't overly bothered that, I kept them in touch with what was going on and sent, the updates and the emails, and gave them every opportunity if they wanted to engage, if we were going down the wrong path or they didn't agree with it or whatever. But but they came to most. So there was 2 representatives from, so Caleb came to most of the ones for, and made sure that, and Bill Carter for initially, and then Maddie after Bill, and Kahu Environmental supported Te Atiawa in that space. Caleb jointly presented when we went for adoption. He came along and jointly presented to council when I did we adopted it. Te Atiawa did come back at one point after that, because the problem, I suppose, is actually getting a clear approval process through council as well. So although the people that were on the committee or steering group were mandated to be there and to do that, and we kind of got verbal confirmation that, you know, it was all sweet back with iwi. There was never anything sort of in writing, I suppose, apart from Caleb coming to that, you know, the adoption. And Te Aotearoa, I suppose, were comfortable that it was adopted because there's nothing in it that's going to derail anything else. Like, it's like a no-brainer. It's kind of, so, you know, if it had gone in a direction maybe that was a little more restrictive, then maybe there wouldn't have been, you know, the willingness to allow it to be adopted in the meantime.
Thank you. Councillor Coe.
Thank you, Rita. That was a very enlightening presentation. You mentioned that one of your aims is to have a good understanding in the community of Te Mana o Te Wai. A couple of questions. Do you think we do have a good understanding in the community? And how can we improve it?
I don't think we do have it. There isn't a great, I suppose, understanding within the community. A lot of the concepts aren't unique to Māori. You know, like we all, you know, I think if you ask anyone in the street, they would say they're, you know, well, you know, we want our waters to be, you know, happy. You know, we want fish, we want our grandchildren to play in the streams. So the actual concepts, I don't think, and sometimes I suppose I would like it to be more widely publicised and not just as a Māori thing, because I think the danger is that we'll get to a point where, because it is a very strict hierarchy, you know, the water, the environment has first priority, then water supply, then stormwater and the other two waters. And that obviously has to be balanced against our need to manage the flood risk and resilience and all the other stuff that councils have to do as a matter of course. So it'll be quite useful, and some of that engagement will be just talking about how do we do that? How do you balance some of this stuff? Yeah, and I just don't want it to be seen, I suppose, at the end as just a Māori thing, because it's not, you know, then it becomes a bit of a blame, you know, well, Ronnie, you'd have to do this because, you know.
Yeah.
You know, so we're trying to avoid that maybe.
Yeah, so how can we get the message through to the community?
I think some of it is Greater Wellington's. Oh, Craig, oh, sure.
Sorry, Rita beat you to it.
Some of this is Greater Wellington's. The Whaitua process is actually all around implementing Te Mana o Te Wai and the freshwater policy statement for freshwater management. So some of it is, but I think we can do something in that space as well. I don't quite know what yet, but we can, you know, like, because it has to, potentially it starts to feed through long-term planning, you know, decisions eventually, district plan reviews. So it starts to colour some of the stuff, maybe how we tender and you know, there might be a component in the tender process that has to look at, you know, Te Mana o Te Wai enhancement or whatever. But, you know, like there's things we can do, but we're not that far advanced. And maybe talking to the community just around very general stuff around I forgot what I was going to say now. But general stuff around. Sean can fill in the gap.
I was going to add in, I guess, so certainly the Whaitua has as a wider ranging community input associated with that process in terms of that committee structure and where that might go, and there's consultation associated with that as far as I'm aware. But there are other elements of work coming up, so the flood management, the update to our flood hazard mapping work, how that then will form its way into district plan provisions. There will be a key piece of engagement associated with that, where a key element to that we can make sure it includes more around the Te Mana o Te Wai and what that might mean in conjunction with everything we're doing in the flood space as well. So that was really the main one. So there's a very key, large piece of work coming where we will certainly look to use that to try and inform the community a bit more around the that Te Mana Te Wai, and the fact that it is actually embedded in legislation, and the way that we're actually engaging and managing in that space is not something unique to Kāpiti as such, but it's I guess a minimum requirement in terms of that legislation as well. So that was all I was going to say. We'll certainly take that on board and look to make use of that mechanism as part of that process.
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say, when I forgot what I was going to say, is it's all around living with more water and how we live with more water. And, you know, there has been some stuff moving through the comms space around that. You know, it's like how we live with it and how we live with it more sympathetically.
If I might add to that through you, Madam Chair, we are looking at how we might package up some more general comms around things like Tākito Kāpiti and the fact that we have work underway around our coastal erosion and adaptation space, that we're looking at stormwater and inland flooding and how that comes together, because we have been talking within an operational context that we acknowledge there's lots of different pieces that are coming together around water management, for want of better words, and making sure that we are able to share with the community when there's opportunities to come and talk about it, that we are coming out and there's going to be different ways that people can get involved to understand, to have their say. And I think that, that's part of what you were talking about with living with water, that will be coming through to you, to have a bit of a conversation about how does that fit in with some of the wider communication and engagement that we might be planning. It is.
Thank you, Chris. So now we'll move on to Christian. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I've got two questions. One is on water quality, and the second is on risk management and defining the hazard. So first on the water quality. Clearly we don't have Lake Horowhenua because that's Horowhenua, not here. But do we have particular water quality issues, and what would be the source of those? Would that be related to urban runoff, or would it be more rural agricultural?
It's hard to say, really. We monitor our stormwater discharges, and to do that you monitor upstream and downstream. You don't actually monitor the stuff coming out of the pipe. We have had issues, and most of the stage 1 consenting requirements is for fecal problems. Yeah. I'm not sure whether that's the best indicator, because when we do fecal tracking for that, a lot of it's avian, which doesn't really have a crossover to human. We quite often find also that sometimes the water quality upstream of our discharge point is poorer quality than downstream. As part of the Whaitua process, there's a lot more, there will be a lot more collating of science and determining, you know, what is the threshold and what are we actually monitoring for.
So am I right to conclude that we just don't really know?
Oh no, we do know. No, we know that our stormwater discharges aren't creating an issue.
Okay.
And that's kind of as far as I can really go. Quite often the discharge is above us, so it may be, you know, cows. You know, a lot of the stuff in the is avian when we do pick up. So we've got a lot of wild birds within the network and around. Yeah, we used to monitor heavy metals, but that wasn't seen to be an issue. You know, that wasn't an issue, so we've dropped that off the monitoring. So yeah, it's kind of a work in progress. And part of the Whaitua and collating of science is trying to work out where the sources are, what's important to monitor and measure and to enhance.
Okay. I think just potentially adding to that, Greater Wellington, they do a lot of, I think every year they do an annual report which measures some of that information. We have someone speaking, Penny is sitting there listening to this. She may be able to make some comments, but I think there's probably work that KCDC does as well as GW, and that's something that I think is really important to get a handle on. There'll be more conversations down the line in that space.
Okay.
Thank you. Any more questions? You have
Yes,
another
so my
question.
second question was about sort of hazards and risks. So you said before about the old district plan, and I get rules were set in the past and then adhered to. So was that about like a horizontal setback or a vertical one, or to deal with a 1 in X flood event? And with regard to what has been happening under the old rules, or the rules that are still in place, do we have a handle at the moment about how many homes are at risk from what level of 1 in X flooding?
We do. The setback is more just around building close to a stream, so it's not necessarily. It's to ensure that the flows can flow and not unimpeded by structures. The flood hazard maps we've got and the rules in our district plan are adequate. The new flood hazard models and maps, we intend, and this will come back to you at some stage, but we intend looking more at a risk-based approach. So at the moment we have flood hazard maps and models that give us an extent and a depth of ponding. Obviously not all ponding is created equal. So, you know, at the moment, like the blue could be 300 mils of water or 2 metres. So the new flood hazard maps and models will be more leaning towards a risk-based approach. So, you know, colour-coded. So, you know, the stuff that's, you know, maybe 100 mils of ponding is not going to cause anyone too much issue and not too much issues for a building. But, you know, 2 metres of fast-moving water is obviously an issue for everything. So just it's more a refinement of, and as modelling gets more refined and more, you know, able to drill down to that detail, then we can actually provide that sort of detail in the planning context.
Right. And when can we expect that? I know it's been sort of trailed that it's coming.
It's coming.
Is that this year or?
The flood hazard models are, the base model's built. We're now doing scenario testing. So the scenario testing stage is when you look at, okay, if this culvert blocks or this culvert blocks, then what happens to the flood water? If the pump station fails, what happens to the water? And then from there you build a freeboard type, so you put some resilience in your model, so that, you know, a pump can potentially fail without, you know, people getting damaged and stuff. So that's the process we're at the moment. That's probably going to take a couple of months or a month. We should have some draft type stuff that potentially could be consulted on June this year. And then the plan change follows on from there. So that will be coming to you in that will become as a separate.
Does the plan change have to be notified or in effect to enable council to say you can't build there, it's too big a risk?
It depends. If it's a land use, then potentially not. The plan change has to occur. If it's a subdivision, then there's a section in the RMA that allows councils to look at the latest information. So potentially for development, for subdivision, yes, we could potentially start using these, as long as, you know, we'd do a community engagement thing around them before we made them, you know, like operative, because that's part of your peer review process. You go out to the community and say, look, this is what we think, you know. What are your thoughts?
So through you, Madam Chair, just on the district plan, we will be coming back to talk about the district plan work program through the subcommittee, and ultimately we will go through a process with you where we determine whether we're going out to notification or not. So you'll get a chance to consider the work that comes through on the new flood risk mapping. And then we'll be stepping through what that means for the district plan. So I think our intention is to make sure that there's lined up consultation through those processes, but it won't be, we won't predetermine before we have that conversation with you.
Okay. Sorry, can I make a comment, Madam Chair? So, I understand the need for consultation and people have their say, but I'm also mindful of people with their own motivations, and they're understandable in many cases, that then result in bad outcomes and people ended up getting flooded because someone say, well, you can't publish that science, or you can't stop me from doing what I want. And then people are allowed to go ahead even though council knew that they would be doing something that put them at risk and others at risk, and incurred liabilities for council for the protection of assets, or potential puts them at risk of litigation for you allowed me to build, or you didn't stop me from building, and now everything's been trashed. I can't insure it. I can't mortgage it. The value's gone, disappeared. Will we actually be able to say, no, this is crazy. You cannot build here at the end of that process?
Yeah, technically we can say no now if we wished. But when I say community engagement on the flood hazard maps, it's kind of just more a socialisation. And if there is, like they say, or we don't think, or my ground's like higher than that, because we do use LiDAR to establish a topography. And it can be quite sensitive to trees, like heavily vegetated. So there is a process during that process where we don't just say, oh, well, you said it's not flooded, so we're just going to rub that out. It's more around, well, we need to investigate maybe further with survey and establish what the ground level is, and then make a determination. So it's not kind of a, and I suppose through the consent process, there's a more formal sort of objection, process that would kind of repeats itself through that process.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Moore, Michael, question.
Thank you, Rita. This is particularly relevant for the community which I live at Te Horo Beach, which suffered quite a significant flood event in December of 2021, when 3 days there was no vehicle access able through Te Horo Beach Road at that low point. And I know it's complicated and was mentioned earlier that there's a combination of responsibilities there in authority over the road and then the Mangoni stream, which aligns alongside it, that caused that big event. And it's not the first time, but that one was quite significant. So to hear your discussion around this, especially protection of riparian corridors, is not incongruous, of course, with our other discussion about looking at managing and rehabilitating the mouth of the Mangoni. That's not part of this discussion, but I'm really interested in how that the repairing or the looking of that in the LTP might be coming, because it's come up a number of times, that access to that big beach community, which is a big population, and there's only one road in, one road out along there. And there was some stormwater work done down on Rodney Ave in the last 12 months or so. I don't know if anybody's evaluated the success of that, because anecdotally some locals say it hasn't made substantial difference to it's a very high water table down there, even though there was some significant works done there, and at least three drains or culverts, however you describe them. So I just kind of add that to this discussion. And of course the Mangoni stream, just to add for the discussion of this committee, was interesting. It's got an unusual history that the local community there, the rural farming community, viewed Mangoni as a drain, not as a stream. And now we're viewing it quite differently. And within the last 100 years, I don't know exactly when, but it was straightened. It wasn't always a long, streams don't like to go that way. They meander and go where they want to. So it was viewed like that. And of course, farming practices in the last 50 years have changed significantly. And I was just looking on land and water informations, the toxicity of the view of Mangoni. And it is improving in some areas with clarity, but nitrogen, etc., are declining. So but the fish and the sea life at the mouth end, which we've been closely monitoring on this other subject, and breeding of rare birds is really active. So that's kind of a good indicator. So I know it was a point of conversation, but I'd just like to raise that discussion around that low point, which is on the corner of Pukenamu and Te Hora Beach Road in terms of flood management. So, thank you.
So if I can make a comment at that point in time, so there's an agreement between Greater Wellington Regional Council and Kāpiti Coast about who manages what streams. And I think that's something that it's quite important for us to realise that different streams are managed by different TAs. And I think that one is managed by GW. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mellon.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So that's exactly correct. So Greater Wellington Regional Council are responsible for both the mouth and the stream itself. But there was an agreed action plan that was developed after that flooding in 2021. The number of community meetings that the chair attended. I attended, I think, at least one of them. So happy to share the output from those meetings, because that actually referenced some work that was to be done by both Greater Wellington and Kāpiti Coast District Council, and some of that was actually the improvement work that was talked about, which were soak pits that were put in to provide some localised benefit. They weren't provided to look to manage anything more significant from a wider flooding point of view, and obviously groundwater is an issue as well. So happy to circulate those or provide them to Michael if you'd like to have a look at that.
So thank you, Mr. Mellon. So in attending those meetings and observing some of the conversations that went behind that, I also thought that there was KCDs who were actually going to be looking at the resilience of access to the Horo settlement, and in particular road. I don't know where that's gone. Maybe that's, I don't know whether you want to make any comments about that now or whether that's another conversation.
I think there's probably better place for another conversation in terms of time frame, but yeah, there was some work that was committed to and actually carried out from a council perspective, looking at alternative access. But again, there was some follow-up work there in terms of modelling levels and looking at what would provide the best benefit in terms of a lot of feedback around raising the level of the road, and some feedback on that in terms of what that might do in terms of effects to other properties downstream as a result of that. So happy to share that with the committee at some point.
That'll be great, thank you. So now we'll move on to Glenn Cooper. Thank you.
Just a quick question in relation to the water testing. I'm assuming for, have we had any breaches in terms of resource consenting for greater regional or other resource consent breaches of our water?
It's not my project, I don't look after it. I don't think we do. Any exceedance has kind of been outside of our control, like upstream sort of or downstream, but yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I can. So I guess there are a number of things at play in terms of exceedances. If from a stormwater management perspective, we have a monitoring program that provides baseline information as to with regard to stormwater quality, and I think the question before around any specific issues, again, that the Whaitua will look to use that to help inform where they think there are priorities that we need to look at, but we don't have the same issues. We don't have a number of uncontrolled wastewater overflows, and we don't have the same sort of water quality issues that you see referenced in terms of Wellington City and an urban catchment like that. We have probably more rural runoff issues, and potentially a combination of, I guess, we've got a wastewater treatment plant that has a discharge consent that we're required to monitor, and we don't have water quality issues, but we've had issues with regard to volume and storage. So there are multiple conditions for each of those consents. So if you're just talking about the water quality one, then no, that's not an issue, but volume certainly is an issue in terms of wet weather volume, and when we're using our storm tank at the Paraparumu wastewater treatment plant, and Waikanae, but again, that might be another briefing that we come and talk to you about, because the Paraparaumu wastewater treatment plant is actually looking at renewing its resource consent. So that would be possibly something that would be quite topical to brief this committee on, where that's at and what that looks like in terms of long term.
Thank you.
Just a follow-up question. Could we just flick back to that slide that had the 6 or the 3 in Te Reo Māori in English? I just had a question about that. That they are the Te Mana o Te Wai. So is that a hierarchical? Like the first is supersedes the second and third?
No, sorry, the 1, 2 and 3 are, so the first priority is environment, water, second priority is public supply, third priority is everything else.
Okay. Is that necessarily a good thing that it is hierarchical?
I think that vote has sailed.
Is that legislated? Okay.
It's
What does that
legislated.
mean in practical terms for us?
It means that, well, we need to meet that priority. Like the first priority is water, the environment, second priority is water supply, third priority. So it means that we need to, I suppose, be more mindful when we are applying for consents, when we're doing our business as usual. Like at the very least, and to be fair, it might be, like I know this is the priority in its statute, but it might be a working towards some of this stuff, because you can't suddenly, like we're going to flip a switch and everything's going to be perfect. So it's working, and it involves, and it also involves a certain level of engagement with Tanawa Whenua, they're involved in that process, and because that's kind of mandated as well.
So am I right in thinking like the first one has heavy components of the second and third, and that's okay in the model? Or is that not right? So for example, the third might be flood protection on a river, which is not protecting health of it and its mirror. But if you don't do that flood protection and your whole downstream of the Waikanae gets wiped out, then you haven't actually met your first, because you haven't put energy into your third or your second.
And I suppose it's the way you protect potentially as well. Like, you might not want to put hard structures. You might put more of a softer engineered solution. It's just making you, I suppose, be mindful of there may be no other solution than a hard engineered solution, in which case there's a bit of a negotiation goes on in that space. And the consenting process or whatever process you're going through to may be more difficult to do. But normally, there are ways of softening, whatever impact you're having on the environment. Or if you're going to do hard engineering, make it sure there's enough space for it to actually move within that hard engineering. Sometimes that's not possible in an urban area because, everything's built up and you kind of need to constrain things, but it's about making the best with what you've got.
Mr. Millen.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I guess it's from a planning perspective, and the NPS, the National Policy Statement of Fresh Water, locked in a lot of this stuff, but it isn't like we weren't thinking. A lot of the stuff is in terms of protecting the health of the water has always been a key part of it, from a consent application for a wastewater treatment plant consent or for a water take for the Waikanae River. We would always be looking to include that in terms of our assessment of effects and looking to try and minimise those issues. I guess now it's more embedded in the planning structure that maybe for someone else that doesn't necessarily think that way, that might be a significant change, but it's certainly, and it may make it harder in some areas where, say for stormwater, if historically you may have piped a stormwater, an open drain or a stream, or you want to extend a pipe network, it does now make that a lot more difficult in terms of the other alternatives that you need to consider, and sometimes, as Rita said, that they don't exist in some places. So it just means we have more of a holistic approach, but not that we haven't been looking at that in the past. It's just now it's more embedded and in the legislation, really.
Thank you. So we'll move on to Glenn Olsen now. Lots of questions, obviously very topical area.
Yeah. Hey, on this as well, I think an important part of it is once, we've got the streams there, they're there, is the maintenance of these and the drains and stuff. And I'm wondering, how does this feed into our programs to maintain the streams and whose responsibility? And what I mean is, if I look at some of the streams around, we have some which seem to be maintained quite well, like the Mazengard stream, I'd say, which, we have put in our waste into anyway, so I imagine it is going to be better maintained. But we have other streams which don't seem to be maintained, at all or very well at all. And I wonder, how do we, proactively monitor the streams at what needs to be managed, and then the responsibility of it. So if I look at in a streams in a residential areas, you've got two bits. You've got one outside a residential property, which can be, between the verge and the house. But then also I know there's plenty where the stream goes through behind two properties. So it's the boundary between two properties where there's no public access. So who monitors these and who's responsible for the maintenance? Because to me, if these are not maintained, then it's going to affect every other area of here. If, they're not maintained, we're going to have more flooding, which can then affect our, water supply and the environment. So what are the programs for these?
We do have a inspection and maintenance program for our open channel network, the same as we do for our pipes. You're right, it can be very difficult if it's at the back of someone's property, and that's kind of historically, some of these open channels haven't been well equipped with space, so it can be quite difficult. Some of our open channel we actually hand clean because you can't actually get a digger in. We're in the process of applying for a global maintenance consent for the whole of our open channel network. And that actually firmly embeds working in partnership with iwi and, looking after the environment when we do that. We do that anyway, like we already maintain our open channel network with the environment in mind. We don't go in too often. You want to go in once and then, because you don't want to, if you keep going in all the time, then you're resetting the little microbes that live in that drain or stream, so the fish no longer have the food that they need. So you try to do it as minimally as possible, recognising that you do actually need to maintain these things because, a build-up of gravel or even vegetation can actually seriously impact its ability to convey flood flows. The Mazengard Garb's a classic. If you get a lot of celery weed, then you can actually decrease the capacity of that drain or stream, to Freudian slip, the stream to convey flood. So it's a balance. It's a balance that we continuously, And I suppose there's also that public-private interface. Some of these open channels have easements, council easement. Some are actually private, so it becomes a little bit of a issue as well.
Yeah. So just one follow on there. So just understanding that, which is great. Do we have a program to actually survey these streams, like all of them, or do we just do the main bits and wait for people to maybe report issues with the rest of it?
We don't tend to survey, especially the smaller stuff, because you can't. Like, it's actually quite difficult to survey a drain that's only 1/2 metre wide and covered in vegetation. As part of the flood hazard, the flood model rebuild, there are cross sections incorporated in that, and we do from time to time resurvey. They're mainly the major streams in the district. We wouldn't do the small drainage networks, but we would actually. So the Wharamuku, there are cross sections through there, and the Mazengard, there are cross sections through there. And if there was ever an issue, we would actually go back to those cross sections and make sure that they are cool.
So, Mr. Mullen.
I'm just going to add, by survey, do you mean actually a topographical survey in terms of the cross section, or do you mean just inspecting them to make sure they're not overrun with weeds? And right, okay, because that was Rita's first comment around the program. There is an inspection program, but following behind that is a clearing piece of work that goes with that. So it's yeah.
So just a supplementary question to that. So in the district, I suppose we have two types of drains. Maybe there's more. One are streams and drains that are part of our stormwater network, and then you have ones that aren't part of it. Is there a priority to maintain those streams and drains that are part of that network, the stormwater network, or how does all that work?
We have an inspection regime, so we would walk those streams and water courses every 6 months, some of them. So we do it on a case-by-case basis. If someone actually rings and says, you need to clean this out, we'll go and inspect and have a look at it and decide whether it needs cleaning out or not. Other than that, there is actually there's a surveillance that we would go out every 6 months or a year or every couple of years, depending on, the need to maintain it, and then we'd make a call from there whether it goes into the works program or not.
Thank you. I had another question, but I've forgotten it now. I'll come back. I know that you're only partway through the presentation. There's two more people at least who are wanting to ask questions. I'll go for Simon first, as you've already asked a question. Rob?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora Rita. Thank you very much for your presentation. Look, my question's around the information that I take back to my community. So you said that, and it's a very high-level plan at the moment. Details are coming. I know that I've raised a couple service requests lately for flooding outside, around the corner from my place. And also heard from the presentation that the plan isn't really there to protect private lands as such. So my question is, how are we working with the private landowners? What practical items or things can we bring back to the community? How do we communicate that? What do I talk to my community about and their responsibilities and how we're working with them?
Sean you can if you want. Okay.
Maybe start, I guess, Simon. So so I guess what we're not saying is that what we have in place at the moment is not necessarily adequate. We're saying that we're providing additional information to help us move forward in terms of stormwater management. So I think the reference before, this iteration of our flood hazard mapping is the third iteration that the council has been through. There have been, I think, at least 2 plan changes that I'm aware of in terms of stormwater flood hazard rules that link into the district plan as it stands at the moment. So the work that Rita's talking about, I guess, is coming out to the community to look to the new flood hazard mapping and what that looks like, but also the further work that's required, again, is looking to enhance the work we've already done to date in that space in terms of flood hazard mapping, and I guess better inform it with obviously climate change and the issues associated with that, but also as we've talked about, the Te Mana o Te Wai in terms of water quality being probably elevated now in terms of a priority for when we're looking at how we manage those issues. So does that sort of help in terms of, because it doesn't change it at the moment. Service requests with regard to flooding and the information we have at the moment, absolutely, that continues. This is I guess is an updated structure that reflects better understanding for some of that, but we do already have quite a significant understanding of those issues. There's some 6,000 properties across the district that are affected in some way by flood hazard currently. So Rita wants to add more about timing.
I was just going to add, there's the current capital works program, like the long-term plan program, so that none of this work derails that. Like it's still progressing. Like this is just and the flood hazard stuff is more enhancement of what we've got, so more detail. Yeah,
Right. So those flood maps we actually have online at the moment, they're all updated and
They're part of the district plan at the moment. You can access that information. They were, I think that was 2012.
Yeah.
That information was updated, and the iteration before that was probably 2002, 2004. Plan change 52. So yeah, that's available currently, and it was used to inform both our planning process and building consent process in terms of minimum floor levels. So.
Yeah, if I may add, Mr. Black, that I think the message to the community is that we do have adequate provisions in place, but we acknowledge that the world is changing around us constantly and we're needing to respond to that. So we have for some time been looking at how we can improve the information we have to ensure that we're making further changes that keep our community safe. And we'll be coming back to update the flood risk hazard component of our district plan. We're confident, though, that what we have now places our community in a good space. So what Rita's talked to you about is how we're linking up to a regional and a national sort of level, that we are, I think, well placed in this space to be doing the right things and to having the right conversations. So that might be some key messages to be able to talk to the community about, and that if there are things happening in the community, that they need to let us know so that we can obviously work in with the community on any issues that emerge.
that's great. That's exactly what I tend to do in the short term. Make them aware that we do have channels to communicate with the council, like through antennae. And I mean, I also, when driving around Kāpiti after a big deluge, or around Otaki, there's a brand new subdivision just off Mill Road, which I see floods regularly. And, I'm just wondering, what are we doing to enforce standards of new subdivisions in that regard? Because we should have adequate drainage already in those new subdivisions.
It may be that we could, because I think some of the other things that Sean's referenced earlier, it might be useful to have somebody to come back and update this committee on what we are doing in those spaces. So we have a lot of interaction with developers and through our resource consent process and our monitoring of those things. So we could have somebody come back and provide an update on that.
That'd be great, thank you.
And I could probably respond to that development in Otaki. The soak pit failed. It was a new soak pit. The developer has reinstated a different, he didn't, I suppose the supervision wasn't, from his side, wasn't as good as it could have been. I don't think he went down to the gravels. So it's been redone.
Great, thank you.
So thank you. So Rob, quick question.
Oh, it's just a clarification of a explanation really might be able to help. As a practicing architect, I've had a few houses in ponding areas, and this is Mill Road. And what you do is you go to council and then you look at the particular area, and then that triggers an inquiry to Greater Wellington. You wait a couple of months, they come back with a height for your ground level because they've determined what the flood situation is, and then you determine how you're going to build the house. If it's going to be on piles, you can build it up with the height of the piles, or if it's going to be a concrete slab, you build the ground up. However, we have struck a ponding situation where we had a bit of a flow with it, so we couldn't have any displacement, so it had to be on piles, and of course it was brick veneer. It was actually a medical centre, and we had to allow for flow by putting a slot at one end and letting the water flow under the piles to the other end and have a slot at the other end. So really what I'm trying to say is that it's a very practical working thing with council and with Greater Wellington, and the risk is determined, talked about, and then you come up with a design accordingly. So I hope that helps. So.
Thank you, thank you. So I've actually got a couple of questions, seeing everyone else, just about everyone has spoken here. So the question I couldn't remember before was actually about the global consent for maintenance. And so we've had some questions about the maintenance program and how that's working. So how will this global consent, maintenance consent, actually help this maintenance program going forward?
Under the new regional plan, under the old plan, there was a couple of permitted activities we could do in terms of maintenance, in terms of taking out vegetation and some sediment. Under the new plan, none of that is permitted. TAs need a consent to go into their open channel network. And even, I don't like to call them drains, but even the man-made drains are actually considered streams under the new plan. And I do understand that, just because it's man-made doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't got habitat value, and that obviously hydraulically connected to the stream. So you don't want something happening in an offshoot or tributary that will impact the main stream. Actually, I've twittered on for so long, I've forgotten the question.
Yes, about the benefits of a global consent, maintenance consent.
It's consistency, I suppose, so we don't have to apply for individual consents for each activity. So it'll allow us to have, and it allows us to have the same consent conditions across the district. So at the moment, if you get a consent for the Mazengarb and then you get a consent for the tributaries of the Wharamuku, for instance, if they're processed by different planning officers, they can have different maintenance requirements, they can have different monitoring requirements, and this brings it all together under one umbrella, which allows you to have the same consent conditions. If a monitoring report's due, it's due at the same time, not due for one consent then, one consent then, one consent then. So it allows for easier administration.
So what you're saying is, under the new rules, that even removing vegetation, you need to apply for consent. So that type of thing will be part of this global consenting process?
Yeah, the global consent is limited to basically vegetation and gravel sediment removal.
Okay.
But that we've thrown in a bit of, if we needed it, to include a wing wall on something that was just erosion protection on a culvert, then potentially we could put that in without necessarily getting consent for it. But it's mainly for stream maintenance.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've got another question I've got is that in one of the earlier slides you talked about hydraulic neutrality, and I know that obviously protecting the water is key, but when there's too much of it, that's when it can potentially become problematic, particularly in a storm event. So we hear this term hydraulic neutrality quite often. And I see it's in the strategy from 2008. I don't know quite what that, well, I've got a general idea about what that means. Is that definition likely to change moving forward? Or first of all, what is the definition and then moving forward?
We've had no intention of removing some form of hydraulic neutrality because that's what we need to do. Hydraulic neutrality is about a development having the same impact off-site that it did when it was pre-development. So in terms of runoff, they work out how much runoff comes off a greenfield site or whatever the site is now. When they develop, they need to contain the water on site and release it in such a way that it doesn't actually, it's the same as if it was still a green site. The problem, I suppose, with our current, it's quite complicated. It's quite complicated for developers, for external as well as internal. And some of the toolbox of things we did, like soak pits, potentially under climate change regime, we will no longer be able to rely so much on soakage to get rid of this water, because if we've got a high water table, that means that the solution gets a lot more complex in terms of ground soakage.
Thank you for that. So in terms of that hydraulic neutrality, is that monitored after these subdivisions go in?
It's there is a process in terms of it being designed, implemented, and we do a final check at the 224 stage. Like, you know, we establish that what is built is as designed, and there's a lot of modelling and thought goes into the design. I'm not sure it's necessarily out the other end. You know, we don't survey afterwards potentially.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I might be able to help there. When you go for if I may, when you go for a consent for your house, you have to display hydraulic neutrality, and you have to get a consultant, and usually in my case the architect, dig a hole 1 metre deep, fill it up with water for 4 hours, and then let it go for the next 4 hours and watch the absorption of the ground. And then you can design through formula how big the soak pit has to be, and that gives you hydraulic neutrality for the catchment of your roof in relation to your site and the pervious character of the site. So every house has to do it when you go for a consent, even an extension. I've had to do it.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Rita. So my other question relates to the flood mapping. So is that actually done based on topography and I suppose the network that is in place, or is it tied into issues that have occurred in the past, and or whether or not all streams and pipes are flowing perfectly? Big question.
It's based on topography and our existing network, and rainfalls on, and the rainfall and the current. We're now including climate, including groundwater profile as well in these new versions of the models, and infiltration into ground. And we've moved to a rain on grid model, so the rain falls on the grid and then it does what it needs to do from that position. And once again, I've twittered on and forgotten what you'd asked.
You did answer.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So that brings us to the end of the questioning for part of Rita's presentation. I'm just wondering
There's
how.
only one more slide.
One more
slide.
Yes, because we're thinking about having a break, but maybe. Yeah,
No,
maybe.
no. This is a very quick. This is one more slide.
Yes. So maybe we'll finish your presentation and then we'll have a break.
Yes.
And hopefully, and there's 1 or 2 questions, or maybe 1 question after that. I'll take that. Thank you.
Okay. Whaitoa. Whaitoa has landed. Penny's here. Jocelyn's on the committee. So it starts in March. We've had a couple of meetings. Runs this year. I think there's time the committee meets, I think, once a month from now on. It's very early days. The terms. Oh, sorry. Yep. The terms of reference between Greater Wellington and iwi have been agreed. Greater Wellington's in the process and have been for a wee while. I'm just collating science and commissioning science to support the process, and the committee members have been appointed. So that's all I was really going to say. So it's landed. The whaitoa is Greater Wellington's response to the National Policy Statement for freshwater. So primarily concerned around allocation of water use and water quality, although sometimes some of the other stuff can't be divorced from that. And I suppose the committee makes recommendations to Greater Wellington, and it eventually will be rolled into the bits that need to be, will be rolled into a plan change and form a chapter in the regional policies, the regional plan. So that was it, really.
So thank you very much, Rita, for your very interesting presentation. Obviously a lot of engagement very topical matter at this point in time, and thank you also staff for providing support to you. So very, very timely presentation, thank you. So we've probably taken it longer than we anticipated, but I think it was really useful having that conversation. But I think we'll have a rest now, have a break now, and then after that, Penny will come up and give her presentation. So, actually, yes. Yes, we'll have a break first. Thank you. 15 minutes. Thank you.
Did everybody hear that? The technical difficulties mean that this room is still live during the break.